The trap of unconditional love with no boundaries. Real love respects doors and locks. If you truly loved me, you wouldn't need boundaries. These words, whispered in bedrooms, therapy offices, spiritual retreats, and family gatherings, have justified more emotional trespassing than perhaps any other phrase in the human lexicon. They've trapped countless souls in the quicksand of false devotion, where sacrifice is mistaken for love and self-erasure for spiritual advancement. It's time to name this for what it is, not enlightened connection, but spiritual bypass disguised as unconditional love. The misunderstood sacred. Mia considered herself spiritually evolved. She prided herself on loving without conditions, on being there for everyone, on never saying no to someone in need. Her spiritual teachers praised her selflessness. Her friends marveled at her generosity. Her family relied on her endless availability. Yet beneath her serene exterior, resentment festered. Exhaustion had become her constant companion. And a question haunted her meditations. If I'm so spiritually advanced, why do I feel so depleted? The answer came not from a guru but from collapse. After being hospitalized with adrenal failure, Mia confronted the toxic spiritual programming that had led her there, the belief that boundaries were spiritual barriers rather than sacred containers. The spiritual gaslighting. The trap of boundary-free unconditional love is particularly insidious because it weaponizes our highest aspiration, love itself, against our fundamental need for selfhood. This manipulation takes many forms. 1. The spiritual bypass. Enlightened beings don't need boundaries, they've transcended separateness. 2. The guilt lever. Your boundaries are just your ego trying to protect itself. 3. The false dichotomy. You can either have boundaries or unconditional love, not both. 4. The devotional demand. If you truly loved me, you would accept all my behaviors. 5. The spiritual hierarchy. I'm just more evolved because I don't need the boundaries you do. These messages create an impossible standard where your very need for personal space becomes evidence of spiritual deficiency. For Mia, the breaking point came when her spiritual teacher insisted that her physical illness was simply resistance to fully opening her heart. This gaslighting, denying the wisdom of her body's collapse, finally awakened her to the manipulation embedded in her spiritual path, the biological reality. What these interpretations of unconditional love fail to recognize is that boundaries are not spiritual constructs, they are biological necessities. Every living organism, from the simplest amoeba to the most complex human, requires a boundary to exist. A cell without a membrane cannot function. An organism without skin cannot survive. These boundaries don't separate us from life. They make our participation in life possible. Psychologically, boundaries serve the same essential function. They don't inhibit connection, they enable it. Without the clarity of where you end and another begins, authentic relationship becomes impossible, replaced instead by enmeshment, codependency, and eventually resentment. The sacred container. The most profound spiritual truth about boundaries is that they don't limit love, they create the container that makes love possible. Think of it this way: water without a vessel spills across the ground, unable to quench anyone's thirst. Water held in a cup can be offered as nourishment. Your boundaries are not barriers to love. They are the sacred vessel that allows you to hold and offer love without depleting your essence. Mia discovered this truth during her recovery. I'd been trying to be an ocean, she realized, available to everyone, without edges. But what people really needed wasn't drowning in my endless giving, they needed the clear water of my authentic presence, which required the container of my boundaries to maintain its purity. The love without demand. True unconditional love is not boundaryless, it is without demand. It says I love the essence of who you are without saying I will tolerate any behavior from you. Authentic unconditional love recognizes that you can love someone without accepting their harmful behavior. You can love someone while limiting your exposure to them. You can love someone and still say no to their requests. You can love someone without taking responsibility for their emotions. You can love someone while maintaining your own separate journey. This distinction between loving without conditions and loving without boundaries revolutionized Mia's understanding of both spirituality and relationship. The body's boundary wisdom. Our bodies innately understand the necessity of boundaries. Consider how your system responds to boundary violations. Stress hormones flood your bloodstream. The nervous system activates fight or flight responses. Muscles tense for protection. Digestion and immunity become compromised. Sleep patterns disturb as vigilance increases. These are not signs of spiritual failure, they are your body's profound wisdom protecting your essence. For Mia, chronic digestive issues, insomnia, and finally adrenal collapse weren't character flaws or spiritual blockages. They were her body's increasingly desperate attempts to communicate what her conditioned mind couldn't yet understand. Her boundaryless existence was biologically unsustainable. The paradoxical truth. Here's the paradox that boundary-free unconditional love misses. True intimacy requires differentiation. Real connection flourishes not when we dissolve all boundaries, but when we're clear about them. Think of it as the difference between two distinct trees whose branches intertwine in the sky versus a parasitic vine that slowly strangles its host. One is mutual flourishing, the other is consumption disguised as closeness. Mia came to understand that her previous approach to love wasn't actually serving anyone, not even those she thought she was helping. By having no boundaries, I wasn't empowering others, she realized. I was enabling them to remain dependent and teaching them that love means self-erasure. The reclamation journey. Reclaiming healthy boundaries after years of boundaryless love isn't an overnight process. For Mia, it involved several essential steps. 1. Permission granting, recognizing that boundaries aren't selfish but essential for authentic giving. 2. Body reconnection, learning to listen to the physical sensations that signal boundary violations. 3. Comfort with discomfort, developing tolerance for others' disappointment or disapproval when boundaries are set. 4. Language acquisition, finding words that express boundaries with clarity and compassion rather than anger or apology. 5. Consequence clarity, determining and communicating what will happen when boundaries are crossed. 6. Support cultivation, surrounding herself with people who respect and reinforce her boundaries. 7. Pattern recognition, identifying the specific relationships and situations where her boundaries were most vulnerable. The most challenging aspect wasn't setting boundaries with others, but overcoming the internalized belief that boundaries were spiritual failures. The new definitio. Gradually, Mia developed a new understanding of unconditional love, one that honored both connection and differentiation. Unconditional love isn't loving without boundaries. It's loving without requirements. It doesn't mean I accept all behaviors. It means I recognize the divine spark in you regardless of your behavior. It doesn't mean I'm endlessly available. It means I'm authentically present when I am available. This redefinition transformed not just her relationships but her spiritual practice. Meditation became not an exercise in dissolving all barriers, but in recognizing the sacred container of her being. Prayer shifted from asking to be more selfless to honoring the divine wisdom of her limits. The door and lock metaphor. Perhaps the most helpful reframing came through a simple metaphor. Real love respects doors and locks. A home without doors isn't more loving, it's uninhabitable. Doors allow us to welcome guests when appropriate and maintain privacy when needed. They create the safety that makes intimacy possible. Mia began visualizing her boundaries as beautiful doors, not walls of separation, but portals of conscious choice. Some doors in her life needed to remain mostly open, others mostly closed, but all required her sovereign right to open or close them as needed. This imagery transformed boundary setting from something that felt harsh or unspiritual into an act of sacred architecture, creating spaces where genuine connection could safely flourish. The spiritual maturity. 3 years into her boundary reclamation journey, Mia reflects, "What I now understand is that boundaryless, unconditional love wasn't spiritual advancement, it was spiritual adolescence. True spiritual maturity isn't about transcending all boundaries. It's about consciously creating and maintaining the boundaries that allow your authentic gifts to flourish. The most enlightened beings she now studies with aren't those without boundaries, but those with clear, compassionate ones, teachers who model the sacred balance between generous availability and self-honoring limits." The assessment questions. If you're questioning your own boundary relationship, consider, do you feel resentful after interactions with certain people? Do you apologize for having needs or limits? Do you feel guilty when not constantly available to others? Have you been taught that spiritual growth means having fewer boundaries? Do you feel more virtuous when sacrificing your well-being for others? Is no a word that brings you shame or anxiety? Do you believe setting boundaries means you're being selfish or unloving? If you answered yes to several of these, you may be caught in the trap of boundary-free unconditional love. The liberation truth. The most liberating truth is this: Boundaries aren't obstacles to spiritual growth, they're essential tools for it. They aren't limitations on love, they're expressions of it. They don't separate us from others, they create the conditions for authentic connection. Real love has never been about the absence of boundaries. Real love is about the presence of respect for the sacred container that makes your unique expression of love possible. Your boundaries are not spiritual failures. They are the wise architecture of your being, creating spaces where love can flourish without consuming its source. Real love doesn't demand that you remove your doors and locks. Real love honors them as the very things that make your home worth entering.